This video is part one of a two-part retelling of a love story, a decades-long on-again, off-again romance between me and a game genre. I'm talking about fighting games. But Jesse, I hear you saying, I've seen Fight Me. I've seen you play Street Fighter 4, Street Fighter 5, and Killer Instinct, and you're not that good at any of them. Why would anyone care what you have to say about fighting games? Well, you're not wrong, but fighting games are one of the purest contests in which humans can partake. They present a fair playing field where there's almost never any element of luck, and where money can't buy wins. Each player enters the match with the same access to the same weapons, and only wits, dedication, and reflexes will decide the result. Good at them or not, I love fighting games, and they've shaped the person I am today. In these videos, I'll recount the story of my relationship with the genre. I'm Jesse Jace, and this is my fighting game autobiography.
Select and make your first pick. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Choose and pick the best one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Select and make your first pick.
Full disclosure, there were no fighting games at the beginning of my video game life. My earliest video game memory is of being 4 years old and having my father hold me up to play Pac-Man on an upright arcade machine at Aladdin's Castle in Oshkosh, Wisconsin's Park Plaza Mall in 1982. I also remember asking, Dad, why does Pac-Man on the side of the arcade machine look different from Pac-Man in the game? And he answered, the one on the side of the machine is just a cartoon Pac-Man. Good answer. Fast forward just a few years, and arcades would start seeing games like Technos Japan's Double Dragon in 1987, and Taito's Kageki in 1988. And impressionable little me would never be the same. I was like, hey, they're fighting. In the street. Street fighting. It was a provocative new realm to see video games step into, the realm of physical hand-to-hand violence. Until then, all I had known were games about eating things, shooting things, making gigantic hamburgers, crossing rivers, raiding rivers, killing garden pests, and whatever it is they were doing in Yar's Revenge. The very advent of punching in a video game was itself a novelty. 1986 had seen Rampage from Bally Midway, in which monsters punch buildings, and sometimes each other, but it was another thing altogether to see the Lee brothers, depicted here by, Henry Rollins and Dave Coulier, knuckle-dusting their way through waves and waves of enemies. I remember my mother leaving my sister and me to amuse ourselves with the small handful of arcade machines on offer in the front of the local Shopko store. When my mom finished shopping and came to get us, she found me playing Double Dragon, and she said, in a really cynical tone, "Great, now they've got games where you fight." And I was like, yeah, great! Now they got games where you fight! The seed had been planted. 9-year-old me wanted to play games about punching and kicking. My idyllic suburban upbringing had suddenly gained a window into the dangerous world of rival gangs, and my parents were understandably not thrilled. Luckily, all this new fascination with violence had very little effect on my real-life childhood, which continued without incident, unless you count the time I punched my best friend in the face and gave him a bloody nose because he was trying to sit on me. It wasn't because of video games. You would have done the same. You didn't want this guy sitting on you. And it was fine. Minutes later, he invited me to stay for dinner. What games like Double Dragon, Renegade, and ER Kung Fu lacked, however, was personality, depth, character voices, signature moves, lore beyond Save the Girl. So when Capcom's Street Fighter 2 came out in 1991, I was swept up in the craze just like everyone else. Here was a game with wild, colorful characters hailing from all corners of the world. They were throwing fireballs out of their hands. They were doing gigantic leaping uppercuts, flying spin kicks, breathing fire. They had electric hair. The kicks were fast as lightning. There was a flying sumo guy with kabuki makeup.
You didn't want this guy sitting on you.
And they were vocal, yelling Japanese special move names no one could really understand at the time. No one could make sense of Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaku. One kid in my school thought they were saying, "My bricks are broken." Another swore he heard, "I like shit burgers." I don't know. Early on in Street Fighter 2's heyday, I prided myself on not only knowing what the characters were saying, but what the words they were saying meant. Keeping Westerners around me informed of the correct pronunciation and meaning of Japanese terminology became a hobby that would endure to this day. Thus began what would be an enduring, if also lonely, obsession with one-on-one fighting games. I say lonely because I was never part of a community of people who played together. I wasn't close friends with any hardcore fighting fans in my school. I would ride my bike to the mall, wait my turn to challenge the afternoon's reigning champion at Street Fighter, fight him, probably lose, and then move on to the next game. I didn't have the discipline, the time, or the quarters to get good, so my appreciation for the art form was based chiefly on the game's design aesthetics rather than tech and theory. I paid close attention to the game's music, something that's not easy to do when you're playing in a noisy arcade. While waiting my turn, I found myself counting the layers in the parallax backgrounds, or noticing the single-point perspective scrolling effect on the floor, which was ahead of its time. After Street Fighter came Midway's Mortal Kombat, a game that looked a lot less graceful and a lot more grim. It was very clearly a game with Asian elements that had been dreamed up by white guys, including the characters, the stage design, and the music, which is still one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time. But as clunky as it looked, it was the new game, and it did draw crowds. The blood that flew with every punch served as foreshadowing, but I was still taken aback and maybe even felt a little sick the first time I saw Sub-Zero pull someone's head off. I remember thinking, that's extreme. Like, that's a little bit much. But teenagers are resilient and adaptable, so before long I was desensitized to this goofy game's carnage and became a competent Raiden player. Mortal Kombat would have the distinction of being the first and, so far, only game I would ever play in a public tournament. Mortal Kombat 2 would improve on the first game in almost every way, cleaning up the digitized sprites and peppering in a ton of hidden secrets. The attract sequence of the MK2 machine had a screen advertising the soundtrack CD by mail order only, and I was like, absolutely I will order that. Much to my delight, the CD I received 6 to 8 weeks later contained not only the Mortal Kombat 2 soundtrack, but my much beloved Mortal Kombat 1 soundtrack. I still have that CD today. It's one of my most prized possessions. After the overt bloodshed of Mortal Kombat 1 and 2, I began to yearn for a more tasteful approach to death and dismemberment. I had also grown to miss the Japaneseness of Street Fighter. So when Samurai Showdown came out, it was the answer to my pugilistic prayers. The characters were inspired by actual historical figures. They said all kinds of cool, archaic Japanese phrases, and spilled each other's blood, but in a graceful kind of way. I usually credit this game with being the one that made me want to learn Japanese. If Samurai Showdown hadn't got me interested in the Japanese language, and Karate Kid 2 hadn't got me interested in Japanese girls, I wouldn't have moved to Japan and subsequently spent the majority of my adult life here. Speaking of girls, 1994 marks a couple more important game releases and the start of a new chapter in my fighting game life. See, I was a teenage boy now, and like most teenage boys, my thoughts and actions had been hijacked by hormones. Woo! Now, the 90s and early 2000s were a dark time for video game gender relations, and we don't need to go back to that. It's a sad fact that fighting games don't often enter the mainstream of public discourse unless their hypersexuality is what's being discussed. I don't want that to be the primary discussion about fighting games, because that's not primarily what fighting games are about. But this was teenage me. And the first time teenage me saw Felicia in Darkstalkers, my hat flew off my head. Orchid from Killer Instinct was walking around looking like she stuffed the entire box of tissues down her shirt without taking them out of the box first. And then I discovered Mai from the King of Fighters, and I think my heart grew 5 sizes that day. Let's not dwell on the sexiness of King of Fighters, because that would give short shrift to its real greatness. Whereas Street Fighter 2 before it had featured characters that looked like weird, gimmicky professional wrestlers, the cast of King of Fighters looked like all the most popular kids from school. I mean, look how fashionable. You had Iori in his bondage pants, Benimaru in his whatever that is Benimaru's wearing, King in her bouncer formal wear complete with cummerbund. Most of these characters look like they're either on their way to the club or getting ready to do a turn on a catwalk. By comparison, Ryu from Street Fighter looks like a homeless man. Well, you know what I mean. Point is, even for a kid like me who had zero interest in fashion, the King of Fighters character designs during the sprite-based era were just too cool to ignore. They defied traditional gender norms in a way that was both progressive and aesthetically smart. and in that way, King of Fighters was ahead of its time from the very beginning. In my opinion, KOF still has the best dressed fighters by far, although recent Tekken games have come close, and Rival Schools was definitely trying. That brings us to the topic of Namco's Tekken, another 1994 release, but it doesn't play a very important role in my timeline for one simple reason. It's a 3D fighting game. Although I played my share of Tekken, Soul Edge, Toshinden, and Dead or Alive, their polygonal nature meant they would always take a back seat to their 2D counterparts. The increasing prevalence of these 3D games made the mid to late 90s something of a dark age for my relationship with fighting games. The technological novelty of 3D characters fighting in a 3D space wasn't enough to make up for the loss of the beautiful sprite and background artwork I had become accustomed to. On top of that, early 3D games felt slow and imprecise in comparison to what I perceived to be the crispness of Street Fighter and KOF. If it looked worse and felt worse to play, then what incentive did I have to play it? So this was a period where I fell a bit out of touch with the genre, which is a shame. Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter 3 would come out, missing Blanca, my favorite character from Street Fighter 2, meaning that I wouldn't discover how good the Alpha series and 3 were until quite a bit later. I remember going to the arcade and playing Street Fighter 3 for the first time, and immediately being dismayed at the absence of both Blanca and Chun-Li. I selected Ibuki, whose design seemed to be the coolest among the new characters, but found her difficult to learn, so I gave up early. If I had just picked good old Ken, I'm sure I would have stuck with it, but that's not how it happened. A lot of the new characters introduced in Street Fighter 3 didn't really grab me, and some of them still don't to this day, even though Remy is pretty obviously Street Fighter's answer to the King of Fighters. Games that only somewhat interested me came out one after another during this period. X-Men vs. Street Fighter in 1996. Mortal Kombat 4 in 1997. Oh, that was a bad one. Marvel vs. Capcom in 98, followed by Street Fighter Alpha 3, which I did like a lot after it came out on PlayStation. Third Strike, every discerning Street Fighter fan's favorite iteration of the franchise, came out in 99, but thanks to my ambivalence about the first two versions of Street Fighter 3, I tragically passed on it. There was no fighting game community in my hometown, and I hadn't yet found the right parts of the internet for communicating with fighting fans far away. I did go to Japan for a 6-week homestay that summer, but Street Fighter Alpha 3, or 03 as it's called in Japan, seemed to be everyone's game of choice at the time. I would continue to go unaware of just how good Street Fighter 3 Third Strike was for many years. If I could go back in time and relive my transition into adulthood, this is definitely one aspect of it I'd do differently. I'd also cut my hair, get contact lenses sooner, maybe not break up my rock band on stage in the middle of a show, half a dozen other things. In 2000, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 came out. I think I finally found it in an arcade in 2001, and I liked how crazy and chaotic it was. Yet I found myself surrounded by people whose appreciation for fighting games wasn't deep enough to get them past all these tag-ins, screen-filling supers, and 50-hit combos. The game was too busy for the average arcade goer. And at that phase in my life, living in Minneapolis and working 2 jobs, I didn't have any nearby friends who were more than an average arcade goer. I felt like somewhere in the world there must have been a community of people who liked games like this, but here I was, living in a city that barely had any arcades. Things got better when Capcom vs. SNK 2, possibly my favorite PlayStation 2 title of all time, came out with its beautiful Capcomized versions of SNK character sprites, interbrand chemistry, and one of the best songs ever heard in a fighting game. I loved this game so much. CVS2 wrote the book on pre-match character interactions. Seeing Ken throw Terry his hat, hearing Dan and Yuri try to out-yo-use each other, these were just icing on a cake that didn't even really need icing. There hasn't been a crossover fighting title as good as this since. When's CVS3, baby? Let's go. 2002 would continue this improving trend when Midway released Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, marking the first time that franchise had shown any improvement since Mortal Kombat 2, 9 years earlier. It wasn't the best Mortal Kombat game, but at least it was a step in the right direction in terms of depth and balance. Granted, the bar had been set pretty low by Mortal Kombat 4. 2002 would also see the release of the game that would rekindle my interest in dedicating myself to learning a fighting game. Guilty Gear XX The Midnight Carnival. It had innovative characters, lore for days, high-resolution sprites, and extra deep gameplay, all wrapped in a sleek hair metal sheen. I loved the air dashing and the high-altitude launch mechanic, and the character's deep hit point reserves meant that you had to get to work on building combos just to finish a match within the time limit. Thankfully, that struggle was fun thanks to the flexibility of the combo system, which rewarded innovation as much as execution. And the fact that one guy designed all the characters, voiced one of them, and wrote the music made Ishiwatari Daisuke my new personal hero. After buying Guilty Gear on the PS2, I shopped it around to friends and acquaintances, trying to find someone who would get stuck into it with me, but like I said, Minneapolis didn't exactly surround me with FGC people, and my search would go unrewarded all the way up until I moved to Japan in 2003. In part 2, I will discuss how my move to Japan impacted my fighting game identity, the new importance of arcades in my life, and how my attention would be directed back to games I had missed out on in the 90s. And then, at the age of 37, against all odds, I start to get good. Look forward to that, coming soon here on Chorus, Isolate, Confirm. Thank you for watching.